From the Donald Danforth Plant Science Center, HEC TV, St. Louis Public Radio, and the Danforth Center present Conversations, a discussion about the future of food in a wealthier, warmer world.
Welcome. Excuse me. Welcome. I'm Jim Carrington, president of the Danforth Plant Science Center. Before we get into the main program this evening, I've got a very special announcement to make. From time to time, we here at the Danforth Center recognize one of our volunteers who has gone way above and beyond in service to the Danforth Center. The Newell S. Jim Knight Jr. Volunteer Award was established 10 years ago with an inaugural namesake of the award, Jim Knight, of course, to honor the spirit of leadership and passion for the Danforth Center embodied in our good friend Jim Knight. Only 3 individuals have been awarded the Jim Knight Volunteer Award. Jim Knight, George Fagno, and the most recent recipient, Jim Johnson, in 2014. This evening, I am very proud to announce the 4th recipient of the Jim Knight Volunteer Award, which I am thrilled and honored to announce is Molly Klein. Molly has served as the chair of our Friends Committee, the chair of this Conversations Committee. She's currently the chair of our Danforth Society Membership Committee. Molly, you have been a tireless advocate and a fearless ambassador for the Danforth Center, not only in this community, but far abroad.
Thank you, Jim.
So on behalf of all of us at the Danforth Center and all of your colleagues on all of our volunteer groups, thank you so much and congratulations.
Thank you.
There you go, you get a standing ovation.
Congratulations, Molly, and what a great tribute to have the recognition both from Molly and from Jim Knight, who are great models of volunteerism and leadership for us in the community. We're blessed to have you. My name is Jim Vonderheit, and on behalf of the Donald Danforth Plant Science Center, I welcome you this evening. I am the chair of our Friends Committee, a legacy which I've inherited from Molly. And I'm delighted to have you here as participants in this ongoing series of conversations. We try to bring experts here that not only bring information to you, but also share part of our mission and bring that mission to life. And the theme this evening, Future of Food in a Wealthier, Warmer World, is built on that platform again. Tonight's program is going to be moderated by Stephanie Raganon, and she is the CEO of FieldWatch, and will feature Dr. Jason Clay, Senior Vice President of Markets and Food for the World Wildlife Fund, and Dr. Allison Miller, the Department of Biology at St. Louis University. I'd also like to recognize 2 groups who have made this evening possible. First, thanks to the Conversations Committee led by Von Brokaw for putting together and promoting this series so effectively. And I'd also like to thank this evening's sponsors, St. Louis Public Radio and HEC TV, for their sponsorship of this ongoing series. On Sunday, March 25th, you'll be able to see HEC TV recording of tonight's event at 5 p.m. and then Saturdays at 7 a.m. throughout the month of April. And we thank you very much for that broadening of the audience for this program. Tonight, we are incorporating one of the new technologies that's very much a favorite of all of you, I'm sure, named Twitter. We are using that to collect questions, so if you want to dally on your phone and suggest a question to us during the course of the conversation, we welcome that. You can tweet us at @Danforth and you can view the selected tweets as they come in at the hashtag of #ConvoSTL. Now, for those of you who still live in an analog world, we have a question card. And between now and about 6:35, we will welcome you to offer those questions up, and we will gather them and assemble them so that our panel can address them in an orderly manner after their conversations. We have more than 380 people here tonight. It's growing to become one of the hottest tickets in town. We welcome you if you were a first-timer. We are genuinely interested in telling our story to you and having you engage with us. Engaging with you in our mission is a critical part of broadening the footprint of all of the work we're trying to do. Thanks to your support, we are able to continue our research in global challenges and around the food environment and helping to attract innovative companies in the St. Louis community. It's extremely valuable for us to have you here. We respect your time and we want to make the most of it. So let's get the program started this evening. Dr. Clay, it's my pleasure to welcome you to the Danforth Plant Science Center.
Thank you. Thank all of you for coming tonight. This is a very important topic, the future of food. But I want to take a moment just to also congratulate Molly, because I've worked for not-for-profit organizations for 40 years, and volunteers are what make them go. And so I would encourage each one of you to find an organization you want to work with. Maybe it's the Danforth Center, maybe it's another place, but it would be great to do this. And this does not come out of my time. So you probably are wondering, why are we all here listening to somebody from an environmental conservation organization talk about food? And it's really very simple. About 20 years ago, we came to realize that where and how we produce food is going to determine the fate of biodiversity and ecosystem services on the planet. And so for us, we've got to get it right. And since we know that if it comes down to a choice of feeding a child or cutting a tree, the tree's going to lose every time, we need to anticipate. We need to figure out how to think ahead to do what needs to be done. And in fact, the Danforth Center is one of the groups that's actually doing work that's going to make this possible. So the Oromo in Ethiopia have a saying, you can't wake a person who's pretending to sleep. We need to realize that food production has had the biggest impact of any human activity on the planet. Has in the past, and it's going to have going forward as well. This is just some of the examples. It's responsible for 70% of biodiversity loss, the same amount of habitat conversion, about 24% of greenhouse gas emissions directly, about 35 to 40% if you take in transportation, refrigeration, cold chain, cooking, waste, etc. It uses more agrochemicals than any other human activity. It's responsible for overfishing. We fish at or beyond 90% of all the fish stocks in the world. And we've lost about half of the topsoil on the planet. That is what food is made of, at least until we figure out how to grow food hydroponically. We're dependent on that soil. We're using 40% of the non-permanent frost land to produce food today. And if you take in mountains, lakes, rivers, streams, deserts, protected areas, you're up to 77%. We couldn't double the amount of land we used. It's not there. So we need to intensify. 100 countries have taken land out of protection to produce food in the last 25 years, and that trend is increasing. That, probably more than anything else, is why I'm here talking to you today. But we haven't just changed the land. We've changed the mammals. Less than 3% of mammals by biomass are wild today. The rest are either pets and domesticated animals or people themselves. In fact, there's one little box there that is for all the elephants in the world. And because of poaching in the last 10 years, that box is half the size today. We've got to figure out how to freeze the footprint of food. And here's the challenge. In the next 40 years, we have to produce as much food as we have in the last 8,000. And now the statisticians are telling us that people are actually producing more children than we thought they were. It's not going to be 9 billion people. It's going to be 11, maybe 11.5 billion people. So that means that figure is actually not right. Here's what it means when we talk about 7 billion people, each consuming 1 unit's worth of consumption. That's 7 billion units of consumption on the planet. If we have 9 billion people, and as the projections say, they're going to have 2.9 times as much per capita income, they're going to double consumption. And that means that's 18 billion units of consumption. To get that to fit on the planet we have today without exceeding the planetary boundaries, we have to shrink the amount of goods and services it takes to produce each of those calories by 67%. Just to be treading water, not to be making the earth a better place. So the issue isn't what to think going forward, it's how to think. What's sustainable today won't be tomorrow. And it'll be the bad practice we're trying to get rid of the day after tomorrow. So this is about continuous improvement. It's about a journey. It's a destination we'll never get to. So how do we get to 2050? We think there are 4 main strategies. One is about productivity, and that's basically built on soil quality, soil health, soil carbon, and genetics. And then there's efficiency. How do we use the inputs, water, pesticides, fertilizers, etc. Waste, pretty obvious. If you waste less, you don't need to produce as much. And consumption. How do we shift consumption to be more in line with the planetary boundaries? And there is no silver bullet for any of this stuff. But added up, it's all going to work. It can all be possible. So on a finite planet, should consumers have a choice about sustainable products? Or should every product on the shelf be sustainable? If you think every product should be, then it's a different strategy. And our strategy is to work with 100 companies which touch 25% of the commodities that have the biggest impact on the planet. And then consumers don't have a choice because the companies have already made it for them. Waste. Everywhere, in every country, we waste about 1 in 3 calories. We've got to figure out how to reduce that. Genetics. It's not a question of if genetics, it's a question of which genetics, and that's going to vary by country. It's going to vary as new science comes along. But we've got to realize that without genetics, we'd be hunters and gatherers. We have basically adapted and altered food. It's not natural. It's called agriculture, not agri-nature. And that's for a reason. Instead of expanding onto new land, onto pristine habitat, rainforests, savannas, etc., why don't we rehabilitate degraded land? Why don't we bring productivity back in areas we've already farmed? We've set a target with the World Bank of 250 million hectares. We think that we can actually do that. We use 1 liter of water to make 1 calorie of food. We're going to have to do much better than that going forward. And then there's climate change and food production. This shows where spring wheat is going to be produced. And basically, in not very many years, it's not going to be produced in the US. Pretty similar to oats, which are no longer produced commercially in the US. Winter wheat. Winter wheat is going to become the cereal grain of choice because you're going to have the winter to grow it, and then before it gets too hot in the summer, you're going to be able to harvest it. So it will become the next animal feed. Where's the Corn Belt in 80 years? It's in Canada. It's not in the US. And it's sure as heck not in Missouri. Soybeans, moving up, not quite as fast, but still moving north. And cotton. Now this is kind of interesting. Southern Minnesota and northern Iowa, the center of the cotton belt, in 2100? Who would have thought it? What we're already seeing is grassland conversion in the US in anticipation of where the crops are going to be grown. And if you look closely at this and you go back 100 years, this is what triggered the Dust Bowl. Do we have the technology to prevent that from happening again? And it's not just going to be row crops. Where are the next food items, the specialty crops, going to come from? In 10 to 15 years, they're not going to come from California. So where's the next place that's going to produce them? California is going to be too hot, too dry, too variable, too high labor cost, too high land cost. Where's it going to be? We got to start asking and answering those questions. So the current food realities are we have 7.5 billion food experts. You're not going to tell them anything. And they're all going to do their own thing. But can we make them more informed? Can we have consensus about what the impacts are? We have a situation where social media trumps science every single time. That's the reality of this. We've got to figure out how to move forward in that. Extremes are dominating discussions. We need extremes to define issues, not to dominate them. We need to create safe spaces like this where we can have conversations. And there is a growing distrust of trade and of globalization. So we had a saying where I grew up, if you don't know where you're going, any road will get you there. We know where we have to go. We know pretty well how to get there. The question is, are we going to be able to do it in time? Think about it. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Dr. Clay. That was very eye-opening.
Jason.
Jason, thank you. So y'all have met Jason Clay. I'd like you to also meet Dr. Allison Miller. She's a professor of biology at St. Louis University, right here in our town. So I'd like to welcome the two panelists here to the stage, and we'll continue the conversation. One of the things that struck me just now in those slides is if all of these regions are moving north, all of these growing regions of our major commodities, what exactly will we be able to grow in the South?
Good question. I think that the next major kind of new wave grain crop is going to be sorghum, and it's going to become a major animal feed as well. When I look at where's the next California going to be, my bet is eastern Arkansas, the Boot Hill of Missouri, western Tennessee, because they've got water, they've got soil, they've got the Walmart's 100 miles west of there. I mean, just think about it. So, and if it keeps getting hotter, then the next major river confluence is Missouri and Mississippi right here. So, I mean, I think we just need to be thoughtful about how we're looking at this stuff. I don't have a crystal ball about what's going to be growing in these areas, but as grains move, so moves animal production. If we can figure out a way to develop perennials, if we can figure out a way to look at cellulose and begin to develop things that out of that, then we can produce a lot in the South. But sugarcane might be another example of what moves.
Allison, what are your thoughts on that? And I know that you work on perennial crops.
Yeah, so I'm really interested in broadening what we consider to be our food sources. And the major crops that we depend on in this country and elsewhere is really just a tiny portion of the total plant biodiversity on the planet, maybe 30 species or less, and there are over 350,000 species of plants. So I think about maybe not which crops that we have today will we be growing in the South, but what will be the new crops? What will they look like? Will they be improved versions of what we have now? Or will they be completely different species? And maybe they'll be longer lived. Perennial crops, some of you may have seen our display out in the atrium with grapevines and some perennial wheat alternatives. So I'm thinking a lot about where we go next and how we use the new technologies and new tools to look at the diversity that we have today and adapt it for the future of food.
So I'd like to dig in on that for just a second. So if we think that one of the solutions can be new crops, I think that there's been very few that have actually been introduced in the last several hundred years. So are plant breeders failing us, or what more can be done so that we see more crops coming to market?
That's a tough question, Stephanie, and I would say no. I think plant breeders have done a tremendous job increasing the efficiency and the production of the crops that we have. And we're living in such an exciting time now where our capacity to look at the genome of plants and to understand the genetic basis of traits of interest, some of the tools and technologies being developed right here at the Danforth Plant Science Center allow us to see plant form in really incredible ways. So I don't think the breeders have failed us, but I think there's a lot more that can be done. And I think particularly there's the exploration of natural biodiversity and thinking about how we might build plants for the future. So one of the things we work on in my group is grafting in grapevines and other perennial crops. This is where you can decouple or think about a root system separately from a shoot system and actually try to develop roots that are very efficient in taking nutrients out of the soil, and then physically graft that, unite it with a separate shoot system. That's a strange concept, but it's actually something that dates back over 3,000 years. And we're really just interested in how we might be able to use this approach for some perennial woody crops.
And I think you're working on grapevines, right?
I am. It's
So
a
that's
tough
something
job.
we can all
It's
relate
tough,
to,
but
I think.
we do our best. Yes, yes.
Yes, very good, very good. So Jason, when I worked for the beef industry almost 20 years ago, we had a staff working on environmental issues. And I think there were environmental organizations that had a very small staff working on agriculture type issues. And fast forward to today, and there are entire teams on the ag side that work on conservation, and on the conservation side that work on the agriculture things. How has that evolved over the years? And do you see that as a positive thing, or do we still have a long way to go in terms of working together?
Well, I think it's got a ways to go. I think there's interest, and that's good. And I would put the onus more on the NGOs than on some of the other groups. I think the NGOs that work on these issues haven't actually pivoted to bring on the right expertise and the right capacity to be constructive critics of groups that they want to help change. And I think they've been all too willing to tell people what to do. I think we've got a problem we've got to figure out how to solve, and we're going to have to do that together by having the tough conversations, by agreeing not to always agree, but by still having the conversation. And as I look forward, I think animal protein is one of the issues that's going to define the first half of the 21st century. Is how do we're moving away from some types of animal protein slowly, but not at a global level, just mostly in North America and Europe. And even then, we're not moving away from animal protein as a category. And with increased wealth, the first thing people do more of is buy animal protein and consume it, because they haven't been able to in the past. So we're on a kind of collision course, not just with the pasture, but also with the feed grains, and then with all the waste and the manure. We got to figure out how to turn that system around and make it nutrient cycling and closed loop and capture the nutrients and put them back on the field.
Having worked for the beef industry, I'm not going to give up my steak anytime soon.
Right.
But
you and 7.4 billion others.
What are the realities of people starting to eat less meat? Is that a realistic expectation?
Well, it's happening already. I mean, so for example, in the U.S., we eat the same amount of meat per capita, but we eat much less beef. We eat more seafood, we eat more chicken, and pork. Other countries have changing patterns as well. Europe is changing their patterns. But in parts of the world, people are going to consume more meat. So we've got to figure out how to address that issue and still have a planet. But I think telling people what to do is not going to work. Hoping they do it is not going to work. So informing people is a good step. You know, this is the implication of that diet. So what are you going to do to make that a lifestyle choice that works in the long term? What are you going to cut back?
Mm-hmm. So Allison, do you think that natural ecosystems can be informed by agriculture, and the reverse of that? Do you think agriculture can inform natural ecosystems?
Absolutely. So I'm an evolutionary biologist by training and have been teaching evolution at SLU this semester. The first chapter of the Origin of Species is entitled Variation Under Domestication. And in fact, most of what we know, or what we first learned about how evolution works, was learned in domesticated systems. And I think we continue to push the boundaries of our understanding of evolution by understanding evolution under artificial selection. So yes, I think agriculture and domestication can inform our understanding of natural systems and how species evolve. But I think perhaps more importantly is as we think forward to what our agricultural systems might look like in the future, natural ecosystems have evolved to be sustainable. And I think it's exciting to think about how we might try to model our agricultural systems after natural ecosystems that have evolved this sustainability. So for example, some of my colleagues at the Land Institute in Salina, Kansas have been arguing for developing a form of agriculture, an agriculture based on perennial plants that are grown in mixtures and polycultures that might mimic that natural ecosystem. Now, I'm not advocating a wholesale abandonment of contemporary agriculture as we know it, but I do think it's important to look to nature and to see what we might be able to learn and to adopt to begin to think about these global challenges.
It's interesting. I mean, I think the issue with perennial agriculture is, can we maintain the productivity? Because what that kind of perennial agriculture does is protect ecosystem services really well. What it doesn't do is protect biodiversity. And so we've got to keep in mind that we need to try to do both. And that's the trade-offs.
Right, and the yield question is a major challenge right now. And I think it's just an amazing time to be a scientist asking that question, can we do it? Is it possible to build a plant like that? And some of the data that I'm seeing suggests that it may be, but we have a long way to go, and we'll see.
But I think the other reason it's also amazing to be a plant person right now is that with climate change, we're going to have to be rebreeding trees every 10 to 15 years with new varieties, to have cocoa, to have coffee, to have rubber, to have cashew nuts, to have palm oil, to have bananas. I mean, all these things that we kind of take for granted, they're getting whacked right now. There is so much temperature change in areas of production that production is down 20, 30, 40, 50%, not just because of the heat, because of the stress. Right. And then diseases that result from the stress. And this is a huge area for plant breeders.
Yep.
I think the orange juice industry, the orange industry is having issues right now, right, with their trees, and that's mainly due to a pest. And I know that they're considering biotechnology to actually start creating trees that can be resistant to these things, but it takes years. On that example, and knowing that orange juice is kind of mom and apple pie, how realistic is it that some of those kinds of technologies can be used to save industries like the orange industry?
Yeah, I guess I'll take that one and say I hope that it can, and I think one of the points of light at this juncture, amidst some really major challenges, is that we have all these new tools that we can use to begin to think about how to do this. And whether or not this is going to be the answer for the orange industry, I don't know. But if it's not one thing, it will certainly be another. And the need is driving the innovation. And I think that is just an incredible thing to witness. And it's also a very hopeful message as we look forward. We do have some major challenges, but we also are living in an incredible technical age that allows us to think about these challenges in ways that were impossible even just a few years ago.
Mm-hmm.
I assume you're talking about greening, right?
Yes, such as greening.
So the question I think that this really raises for us is, instead of trying to breed a tree that's resistant to greening, can we actually look at greening itself and use our technology to thwart greening directly? And then Sikatoga with bananas and other diseases, rather than actually trying to breed all these things into the plant, which would take longer because the diseases are actually more simple genetically than the plants are. So maybe we can use the technology in a different way. And it would have less consumer issues, I think, too.
Yep, I agree.
So on the topic of new technologies, how do we prevent something like gene editing from becoming the next GMO in the public acceptance space and public perception space?
You want to give the technical answer, and I'll give a lay answer.
Well, I have a general answer. I think if we embrace the challenge that we're facing, which is how are we going to feed people, because we all need to eat every day, and our population is growing, but how are we going to do it in a sustainable manner? How are we going to do it without completely running off the map that was shown earlier? We have to be able to have conversations just like what we're having today about different types of tools and about how they work and what we know about the pluses and the minuses. I personally don't feel that, I don't think we have the luxury to fight for the sake of fighting. I think we need to think critically about the best approaches that can be used today to meet the challenges that we're all facing. So how to not have a GMO fight about gene editing? My answer is to focus on the issue, which is not GM or gene editing. It's this challenge, and what is the best way to go about it? And hopefully that will, I'm not saying it's not worth discussing, but I don't think we want a polarized situation. I think we want a conversation about how to move forward.
I think this is where that issue of social media trumping science comes out in spades. My organization we don't have boots on the ground around agriculture. We're not an agricultural organization. We have concerns because it affects our mission. We want to create awareness about issues so that other people that are smarter than we are can go out and solve those problems. We want to use our good name to create platforms where we can have discussions about difficult issues. And I think that's really where we need to head with this. We've got to create a safe space in the middle to have a conversation. And it's not just about this, it's about animal protein. It's about all kinds of things. The extremes can help define the issue, but they can't dominate it the way they have. And we've got to get beyond that. And some organizations and companies and governments have to be resolved to help make that happen. We can't just hope that it will go away or wait for it. It's not going to. I think I was going to use a metaphor that I won't, but I think we're primed to have that discussion go right down a rabbit hole. And we have to prevent that because we can't take any more tools out of the toolbox. We don't have enough already.
And maybe I can just add that humans have been manipulating plants for 10,000 years for the purposes of food. And there are different ways that process has happened over time, including traditional breeding, but also things like mutagenesis and genetic modification and gene editing, and there will be something else that we don't even know what it is yet. So the process of manipulation, that's how we got the plants that we use today. I think a healthy conversation about the best approaches for the goals that we have is part of the process. But I agree, it's not worth it to take a tool out of the toolbox for the sake of just a problem with that specific tool. And so.
I mean, it's just, with the exception of, say, morel mushrooms and black walnuts and fish, actually, wild fish, none of the food we eat is natural. It's all been manipulated. And if we started from that point...
There's natural on all this packaging at the grocery store.
But if we started from that point, then it would be much easier to have the discussion we need to have. Because it's part of a long process that goes back 15,000 years with animals. So, I mean, it's interesting. Can we do that?
So I was just saying there's all this natural verbiage on our packaging at the grocery store. I won't go down that rabbit hole, but I will say a lot of consumers are buying more products that are certified organic, certified XYZ. Is that having an impact on agriculture's footprint in a positive or negative way?
Right.
Or is that just another option for consumers at the grocery store?
Well, it's certainly an option for consumers, and it's a personal choice that consumers can use. They can vote with their money, as it were. I think, though, from the point of view of the problems that I was trying to lay out, it's not going to solve the problem. In fact, my organization has been instrumental in creating standards for probably 2 to 3 dozen different critical commodities because we wanted to build awareness about what the impacts were, get expert opinion about what could be done to reduce it, and then set a standard that would show what was more sustainable, and then begin to raise it over time as we needed to. And what we found at the end of the day was the people who were getting certified were already the better producers. In fact, the bottom 25% caused 50% of the impacts and only produced 10% of the food. So if you want to think about this logically, where do you get the most productivity gains and the most environmental impact reductions? You work with the bottom. Now, most NGOs don't want to do that because of reputational risk, but that's what we really have to do. And I think if we looked at each of these, where's the worst part of this problem? How can we either get it better or get it out into something else? We have to be more strategic.
So you said the buzzword sustainability. It's been a long time buzzword,
More
actually.
sustainability.
I used to work at Monsanto and actually on the sustainability team. And we had trouble even internally defining what sustainability was, both to our internal audience, but even how we wanted to project that externally. I think fast forward all these years later, sustainability has almost lost its luster in terms of what it stands for. I know you travel the globe talking about these issues, and I know you do a fair amount of traveling. I'm just wondering, does that term have relevance anymore, or is there some other way we should be positioning this?
I think that what I found is that when we got into trouble when we tried to use the term to define an absolute state. Something is sustainable or it's not. And so how I used it just in that sentence was it's more sustainable. Mm-hmm. And that's better than less sustainable. And it's about continuous improvement. But to have continuous improvement, you need metrics. You need to be measuring things, and you need to be measuring what's significant. And also probably what people have control over, what farmers can change, what companies can change. So there's a whole lot embedded in that now that I think has begun to make it a more relevant term than it was. It may be outdated, but I don't see that we have anything else really.
I agree. I agree.
Yeah, and I think one of the issues that I have with the term sustainability is that it really encompasses so many different things, so many different actions and fields, and this kind of gets at a key, I think, theme of this conversation is that there is no single act, there is no single thing that needs to happen to solve it. There are millions of them, and maybe we can think about the term sustainability as a broad umbrella term for being able to live on the planet and not destroy it, but acknowledge and embrace this concept that there are so many threads that are required to come together for that to happen. We want to make this an inclusive conversation that really engages people of all types and backgrounds and interests. And so I guess I accept sustainability as a very broad term and that is appropriate for what we're trying to do. Mm-hmm.
But I think also, just to build on what you said, we can't possibly work productively on 1 million things. We can't work on 100 things. We can't work on 50 things. But if we can agree on 3 or 4 things that are key, right, we can actually work on them. We can produce results, and then we can work on 3 or 4 more. And our opinion about what the second 3 or 4 may have changed over the 2 or 3 years it takes us to solve something. But we've got to make the problem digestible. We've got to make it actionable. Right. And right now, if we gave every one of you a packet of yellow stickies, you could all write things on the wall, it would be yellow in this room. Because that's how many things we can think of. That's not how many things are important. There are a few things that are important.
So drilling in on that, what do you think the 3 to 4 things could be?
So from an environmental point of view, just to be clear, it's about habitat, and that includes biodiversity. It's about soil health, and I think the single best indicator of that is soil carbon or organic matter, depending on how you want to talk about it. It's about water take and effluents. It's about greenhouse gas emissions, because right now, producing food is the biggest source of greenhouse gas emissions on the planet. And it's probably about toxicity, because we've got to keep the chemicals that we use so that they're not causing other problems. So if you dealt with those, and you put metrics on those and gradually ratcheted them down, but not just per unit, in total, That's the thing that we have to do. We have a lot of companies that want to say, we're going to reduce per unit of product. We need them to have total reductions to get that point by 2050 that you have to shrink everything by 67%. Every calorie that you consume needs to be produced with 67% less energy, less greenhouse gas emissions, less water, less soil erosion, et cetera.
Allison, how about you? Are there a couple things that you think in this time and in this space that we could really try to pinpoint and work on?
Yeah, absolutely. And I agree with everything that Jason said. Something that I think about a lot is just our fundamental understanding of biodiversity on the planet, its distribution, how it's evolving, how it's changing in response to our changing climate. It's very difficult to think about loss when we still don't really know what we have. And there are some terrific organizations here in St. Louis, the Missouri Botanical Garden and the zoo and others, that are making great progress in this area. And I think we want to keep that at the forefront. I think we also want to think how that biodiversity can be leveraged to get at some of these longer term goals. So those are the things that I'm thinking about. Okay,
let's go to the Twitter wall. Please send your questions in, by the way, but I think we've got a good one right here. Oh, I'm sorry.
Write it on the old analog, the piece of paper.
Yep, there's pieces of paper. Someone get Miss Karen a piece of paper.
There, she's got one.
So I think this one would be for you, Jason. How do we change the mindset of people, especially in developing countries, to rebuild soil instead of continuing to tear down forests to create new cropland?
So this is where I think we have to look at what the assets are we have. We're just doing a lot of work in Brazil and trying to figure out how to kind of stymie the arc of deforestation in the Amazon and the Cerrado, another critical habitat. And one of the things that, by working with Bunge and Cargill and others, we've realized is that 28% of the soy is lost between harvest and port. Now, in the US, we don't think of grains as actually having post-harvest loss. I mean, that's an Indian problem or whatever, but in Brazil, that's a big problem. Well, 28% is also a potential large amount of revenue that's being lost. So could we begin to build infrastructure in the old areas that would draw those crops, that would save that waste where there isn't infrastructure like roads and railroads and things? That would then create increased prices for the land, so there would be an incentive to rehabilitate degraded lands in those areas, but it would also cut the frontier areas out of the market because they would have to haul back to those areas and it would make them less effective. So there'd be more pressure on intensification in those areas and less pressure to expand. We've got to get smart about how we change the incentives. That's just one example. I mean, I think most farmers know that they're losing fertility and losing soil. They don't often know how, depending on who they are, et cetera. But in the past, land has been cheap. That's not going to continue to be the case. And we're seeing China beginning to rent grasslands in Mongolia and the stands and the Russian steppes to produce grain that has never been farmed before. It's like that map that I showed of grassland conversion in the US. The same thing is happening with the Belt and Road program in China.
And maybe we need to think creatively about what it is that's being grown in these areas and to choose species based not only on their yield and economic potential, which is of course the main focus, but also species that can simultaneously serve this purpose of rebuilding the soil. And so I think we need to think about developing and identifying crops that meet both economic needs and human needs, but also ecological needs.
The other thing that, I mean, anywhere in the world that would get farmers to really manage and measure soil, carbon and soil, is to pay farmers for carbon. And Marks and Spencer's in the UK, a really progressive retailer, has been buying all their renewable energy from their animal protein people, and they're causing them to go into biogas, and they're buying that renewable energy. Well, now they're starting to buy soil carbon to offset their other carbon impacts that they can't eliminate. And they're doing it on 5 and 7 and 10-year contracts so that it allows the producers to invest in better strategies. McDonald's has started expressing interest in looking at soil carbon. So we're beginning to see some of these kinds of things. Will this happen without a carbon market? Not so much. It'll happen a little bit. It'll be a novelty thing. But if we actually had a carbon market, it would happen like that. Because then a farmer could make as much selling carbon as they do selling other things. And they would take land that's marginal out of production because they could actually grow carbon on it.
We do have to incentivize the farmer. And I think that one of the surprising things I've learned in being in this space for a while is that a lot of times these practices are actually good for the bottom line, but convincing the farmer that that's true is sometimes tough. So
Pilots are important, but it's got to be pilots on farms that farmers are actually running.
So I love this question, having worked in, I'm a recovering communications person. How do you get the average individual to care about the future of food and the lack of current solutions? You're in front of an audience that has an elevated sense of the urgency here and it has an interest in this, but for the layperson, that is a true challenge for us. Allison?
I think one of the easiest ways is to be creative in your eating. And there are a number of chefs and restaurants, even here in St. Louis, that are really taking very novel approaches to food and where food comes from and sourcing things locally and talking about those items on the menu and even in their restaurants. And I think for people who are wondering where to start, I would say just start eating and asking questions about what it is that you're consuming and where it comes from. And it's for the concern about the lack of current solutions. Events like this are really critical. And this is where social media, I think, can be very helpful, where we can begin to tell the stories of some of the positive changes and positive advances that are being made today. And hopefully, if more people can get out and start talking to broader audiences and maybe eating with some of those audiences, we might be able to touch that group a bit more than we are already.
17% of all social media photos are about food. They're about holidays around food, they're about birthday parties, they're about other things, but it always comes back to food and recipes and farmers markets, all those things. And I think what's good about that is that it's millennials mostly that are dominating that. And they're the people that actually need to change. And just to throw another angle at that is that it always struck me when my kids would be playing computer games and things, and I was thinking that's such a waste of time. But then I began to realize that when I was their age, you read the instruction manual. And what I realized that with my children, they were all playing games before they were 6. They couldn't read. And they had developed a whole sense that they could just do it. And if they didn't get it right the first time, they could do it again and again and again and again and find the emerald and find the tool and find the thing. They believe they can make change happen. They believe they can win. Well, those of us who are over 50 didn't grow up in that kind of world. Things did break, and it was expensive to fix them. But now we have a different mentality. Let's work with it. Let's empower it.
Absolutely. So let's go to another Twitter question here. What would be the land use for food production if more of the population were vegetarians or at least ate much less meat? Did that question make sense?
Yep.
Did I say it correctly?
Yeah.
Okay.
So animal protein is the issue that's going to define land use for the next 30, 40, 50 years. And it cuts both ways, actually. We work in the Northern Great Plains with beef producers who, because they have their grass-fed beef, they are the frontier between the cropland expansion and soil erosion and all kinds of other things that happen from that. So we want to see them continue. But I think that the answer is it depends. We're just starting a big study now. Abandoning land from livestock is not going to reproduce biodiversity. It's just not there. We're not going to have 120 million buffalo or bison roaming the plains anytime soon. It would take a long time just to rebreed that herd from the 200,000 or so we have today. So I think that some of the studies that I've read suggest even like a greenhouse gas issue, habitat issues, et cetera, it depends on how efficiently something is produced. And we're finding that for anything, whether it's a pulse or an egg or dairy or beef. There's differences between them, but often the differences within the system between the best and the worst is 100 or even 1,000 times different in terms of how much land, how much water, how much energy, how much labor, etc. So yes, we could reduce in some ways probably, but who's going to tell who what not to eat?
Yeah, I totally agree, especially in the developing world where they're just now getting access to some of these things that we've been enjoying, forever.
As populations age, people eat more thoughtfully, and they eat things that they think are healthier that will allow them to live longer. So I think some of that actually starts to play out. But that's why the millennials are so important in terms of adopting some of those strategies earlier in life.
So I think on the community gardens, we kind of hit that earlier. I'm really curious. I'm going to go off script, off the Twitter wall for a second. But as a volunteer here, and as someone who has worked in the big ag space, where we were doing a lot of good work that rarely was able to break through because of all the noise, how does a place like this, that frankly doesn't have those reputational issues, and has nothing but blue sky in terms of the ability to communicate what is going on in innovation, what is going on in agriculture and sustainability, as you guys are kind of out and about and you have your finger on the pulse of these things, how can we better leverage the Danforth Center and the efforts happening here and places like this?
So let me just give 2 examples, and you can then come up with some good ones. We're concerned about the loss of this rainforest in Central Africa and the Serengeti because people are going to. This is the continent that's going to have more population growth, more increase in income, and is already food deficit, so they import a lot of food. So there's going to be pressure on that land. So we started a project to actually identify and map the genomes of the 100 most important food crops that have never been really benefited from modern plant breeding. We're 70 of those crops have been mapped, will be done by the end of the year. Now that's moving into training the people that can do the marker-assisted breeding and produce planting materials for farmers. There is a role for this center in that kind of work. But I think there's also a role for this center in stranded assets and urban agriculture and hydroponics and what that means from a plant breeding point of view, because anything that we do in the States is going to immediately go to India and China because they have even more stranded assets than we do. And developing countries do too. Places like in most of the big cities in Africa, they will be 80% of the populations in Africa by 2050, 2060. So we need urban agriculture. And I'm not an expert in this. I don't know what that means for plant breeding, but it's got to mean something if we're going to try to produce more closer to where people live.
Yeah, so the Danforth Center, I think, has almost an unlimited capacity to drive this conversation locally, nationally, and globally. I think one of the most important things that I see here at the Danforth Center is the cutting edge nature of the science that's happening, the tool development and its application to really push the boundaries of how we're thinking about our crop plants and how we are thinking about our agricultural systems. And there's an inherent excitement around that development and just that spirit of being able to make a small impact in a major issue. So one of the things I like to see the Danforth Center doing is conveying that excitement of discovery and potential application. I think through partnerships, and I'm part of a partnership because my home institution is St. Louis University, but through local partnerships in the region and across the world, which I see a lot of room for expansion in this area as well. I think this will only just amplify the core mission of this center and its impact on multiple scales.
Thank you all. This has been a very fascinating conversation here at the Danforth Center. And before we bring Dr. Carrington back up to the stage, I would like you all to give Jason and Allison a big hand.
Wow, thank you so much. I am going to close by just giving thanks and making a comment or two. Jason, thank you so much for coming from WWF here to the Danforth Center. You proved two things. Number one, World Wildlife Fund is not just about pandas anymore. It's about a whole set of things, including agriculture, that I think a lot of people may have been surprised to hear about. But the more we interact with some of the major organizations like WWF, Nature Conservancy, you're doing great work, and we really appreciate it. You also proved the point that the Danforth Center is really relevant. So thank you so much for doing that. Allison Miller, thank you so much for joining us. You're going to be seeing more of Allison. One of the partnerships she didn't talk about is with the Danforth Center. Funny story, last year at our scientific retreat, Allison was our keynote speaker. At the moment she was giving her keynote address, her lab was burning, literally burning, in a catastrophic fire on the SLU campus. Her lab was destroyed. I said it's a funny story because we had some nice facilities that were waiting for someone like Allison to come occupy. And it was an opportunity for Allison to move her lab to the Danforth Center. She's in residence now, as is her lab, and we hope to keep her here. Stephanie, thank you so much for moderating this event. You have been a star with the Young Friends. Not that you're not young anymore, but we all, we very much look forward to you taking on more and more roles here at the Danforth Center, including fitting in on the rotation for moderating conversations. Thank you for doing a great job. So that's it. Thank you all for coming. We'll see you next time in August. Have a safe trip home.